Well, what's up, YouTube land? I got a lot of stuff going on, and thought that I had figured out what was causing the overheating of my Veloster, but apparently I've caused more issues. I don't think that I shut it off fast enough when it was overheating when I was driving back from Florida, and I have caused the cylinder head gasket to bust, and I'm getting compression from the cylinders into the radiator system, and it's blowing all of my coolant out. So this video is going to show how to replace the cylinder head gasket. Really did not want to do this. I didn't want to do any more work to this car. I wanted it to just sit until I was able to do the Genesis swap. But with the divorce going on and all that, I have to keep these cars running so that I can keep going to work. So that being said, I'm going to start replacing the cylinder head gasket on this 2012 naturally aspirated Veloster. I also, just on a side note, my brother has purchased a vehicle from Copart, 2018 Toyota RAV4, that I'm doing some repair work to, and I'll have a series of videos on the repairs that I'm doing to that car as well. But the focus of today's video is going to be replacing the cylinder head gasket on this Veloster. So I'm going to wind up having to remove, I'm more than likely going to pull the engine to do this. You can do it in the car, but for the ease of videoing this, I'm more than likely going to pull the engine and put it on a stand to do it so that I can show clearly exactly what has to be done. It is definitely doable in the engine bay, but it's a little bit harder, and I wouldn't be able to film as detailed as I will if I pull the motor. So I'm going to pull the entire motor, put it on an engine stand, and go through the entire process of replacing the head gasket. The thing that sucks about this is you have to remove the front timing cover and the timing chain in order to remove the cylinder head, because it's got a timing cover that bolts to the cylinder head and the block. So you have to remove the oil pump, or not the oil pump, you have to remove the oil pan, crank pulley, timing cover, valve cover gasket, exhaust manifold, intake manifold, and then the cylinder head. And I believe you have to remove the cams as well. I haven't done a head gasket on one of these yet, but it doesn't bother me. I'll do it and I'll show you guys as I do it. They're all pretty much the same. There's some little bit of difference in the procedures, but generally speaking, all the timing systems and head gasket replacements on most motors are exactly the same. I do know on this engine you do have to replace the cylinder head bolts because they're torque to yield bolts. And a lot of the gaskets are O-ring gaskets. I'm going to determine whether I'm going to replace the additional gaskets when I tear this engine apart. Typically I would replace all of them, but because I'm on a time crunch, I have to be able to drive this car to northern Indiana on July 5th, and today is June 30th. So I don't have enough time to wait for the parts to be shipped in. So I'm going to have to do this on the fly as fast as possible to try and get this car back on the road. So with that being said, I hope you enjoy this video. All right, guys, now the fun one starts. I'm going to start pulling the engine out of this freaking nav and replace the head gasket. Really am not looking forward to this, but got to do what I got to do to keep on moving. So flip the camera around and show you where to start. Like I said earlier, you can do this in the car, but I'm going to pull the engine out of the car because it's easier for me to show you in the video where everything is. But first thing you're going to have to do, obviously, disconnect the battery, remove the battery, remove the air filter, air box, air intake and all that, and remove the top engine cover. Top engine cover just pops on. So there's the top engine cover off. 10 millimeter for the battery here and here. Loosen those, they'll both come off. 12 millimeter clamp bolt down there. Take that out, the battery will come out. Air box, disconnect these clips right here. You got one there and one here. And then the air box will pick up. You have to disconnect this hose and then disconnect right here, and the whole top half of the air filter will come out. And then there's bolts holding the air box in. There's one here, one on the bottom, and one right there. And those are 10 millimeters. So you got a 10 millimeter there, 10 millimeter there, and then another one right here in the front. This picks up and comes out. So there's your other bolt. So you got one there, and one there. You don't really have to take these clamps loose. You can actually leave the whole air filter box assembled and just take the 3 10mm bolts out, disconnect that 10mm hose clamp, and disconnect this hose from the top of the valve cover, and then the entire assembly will come out as one unit. And I guess this is just my luck, but as soon as I started working on this freaking car, it's starting to fucking rain. So I'm gonna keep going as long as I can, but I may have to freaking stop because it's starting to freaking rain. I'll let you know how far I get. All right, once you get the battery out and the air box out, and I cut the shit out of my hand when I was taking the air box out. But once you get both of those out, you need to take the ECU bracket off, and then you're gonna have to pull the battery tray out. So the battery tray is held in with 3 12mm bolts. So there's 1 here and 2 here. The ECU bracket is held in with a 10mm bolt here, 10mm bolt here, and a 10mm nut here. Once you get those done, you can disconnect the ECU. Get that one out of the way so that I can open that one all the way. And once you get both of those disconnected, just pick it up and swing it out. So now the ECU's out. Now I'm gonna start taking the battery. All right, I missed a bolt. There's a 4th bolt in the back that you gotta take out. So there's 4 12mm bolts that hold that in. There's 1 right here, 1 right here, 2 right here, or no, 1 right here, 1 right here, and 2 right here. Okay, now that I've got the air box, the battery tray, and the ECU box out of here, I'm gonna start disconnecting the wiring so that I can get it completely off the engine. So I'm gonna disconnect every single wire that's going to the engine, wherever there's a quick disconnect, and pull the wiring harness so that I can get the engine free. So I'm gonna disconnect the AC connector down here, disconnect the alternator, disconnect the cam position sensor, disconnect the, I believe that's a VVT solenoid, I'm not sure. Disconnect this main connector that runs to everything underneath the intake, and then disconnect my coil packs, disconnect the vacuum valve, all these different solenoids and whatnot, cam position sensors, and get all that wiring harness set off to the side so that all I got to do is remove motor mounts, CV axles, disconnect the exhaust, and disconnect the radiator hoses, and then I'll be able to pull the motor. I'm gonna pull the motor out the top. So what I'm gonna wind up having to do is I'm gonna have to remove this engine mount completely. I'm gonna have to remove the transmission mount completely, remove the wishbone that's mounted on the lower bottom of the motor, disconnect the fuel lines that are running into the high pressure fuel pump, disconnect the vacuum line that's running to the brake booster, and disconnect the heater hoses for the heater core. Once I disconnect all that and the shifter linkage, because this is a 6-speed manual, so I have to disconnect both of the shifters, or both of the shifter cables. Disconnect all that, the wiring to the starter, the wiring to the throttle body, and I should be able to have everything free, and then I'll have to remove the slave cylinder for the clutch. Get all that disconnected, and then I should be able to pick the motor up. What I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna unbolt the AC compressor, and I'm gonna leave it in the car so that I don't break the AC system loose. That's the only piece that's gonna be left in the car, is the AC compressor, the lines, the condenser, and all that stuff. Okay, so you're supposed to be able to use this little black piece around the high pressure fuel pump line to disconnect the line, but for some reason mine won't release. So I just took the 2 10mm bolts out of here. There's 1 in the front and 1 in the back, and then unscrewed the low pressure or the high pressure side of the line out, and then lifted it out. And then there's a piston in here with a roller, and it's got a key on it so that it'll only go in one way. There's the key right there. So if you try to put it in the valve cover and you don't have it in the right spot, it won't go down. So it won't go down, but if I turn it where that key's lined up, it'll go down. So go ahead and pull that roller out. Keep it clean while you got it out, and don't lose it. I'm gonna go put this in the car in a sandwich bag so that it stays clean. Okay, so I've got the entire wiring harness removed from the top of the engine. There is 1 ground wire that's screwed in right here, and it's held in with this 10mm bolt. You can disconnect this piece off of this bracket and this bracket by sticking a screwdriver in here and pulling up on this, and then on the one on this bracket, it's on the bottom, so you got to push down on it. But once you get that loose, that whole piece of wiring will come out. The fuel lines are disconnected. Vacuum line is disconnected. So now I just got to disconnect my heater hoses, disconnect the radiator hoses. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to disconnect the radiator hose from the radiator and from the water outlet, and I'm going to unbolt the water filler neck from the intake manifold and take the entire hose assembly out just to get it out of my way and give me a little bit more room. So you can either disconnect the hose here or you can disconnect it from the overflow tank. I'm actually going to disconnect it from the overflow tank so that I can take all the hose out. Okay, so I've got the hose disconnected from the water outlet, got it disconnected from the radiator, and I got it disconnected from the overflow tank. So now I just got to pull these two bolts, two 10mm bolts, and the whole water neck. All right, as you can see, now I've got the entire water neck assembly out of here. Those are the two bolts that were holding the water neck to the intake manifold. The only other wires that I have to disconnect are to the throttle body. Now I'm running an oversized Elantra throttle body, been running it ever since this car had like 30,000 miles on it. So I've had the coolant bypassed on it as well. It's been bypassed ever since I put the throttle body on here. But I'm going to disconnect the throttle body, disconnect this, I think it's a vacuum sensor or the flap valve inside the intake manifold, and then disconnect. There's another connector here, and then I'll have to disconnect the battery wire to the alternator. I'm going to go ahead and actually remove the alternator. And I'm going to remove the AC compressor. I'm going to remove the alternator just so that it's easier to get to the AC compressor to remove it. Okay, now I've got the entire engine harness completely separated from the motor. There's more connections down here than I remember, but there's a connector here, the starter connector, there's a knock sensor connector, then there's this connector, which I think is a crankshaft position sensor. And then this connector, I'm not sure what all these connectors are. I'm not going to guess at what they are, but there's two right here. One for the starter, one for the knock sensor, one for here, and then one for the flap on the intake, and then for the throttle body. Now, the only wire that I have left to disconnect is the main battery wire to the alternator. And then I should be able to pull this entire wiring harness through. I'll have to disconnect that bracket from the transmission. I'll have to disconnect. I got to disconnect this bracket anyway to remove the slave cylinder, so I'm going to remove that bracket. Instead of pulling the hose off the bracket, I'm going to remove the whole bracket. And then I'm going to take the two 12mm bolts that are holding the slave cylinder in and take the slave cylinder and everything and swing it all over here to the side. So then the only thing that'll still be left holding it to the car at this point is the shifters cables, the heater core cable hoses, CV axles, and the lower radiator hose. So I'm going to disconnect the lower radiator hose after I get the alternator out. And once I get the alternator out, I'll take the AC compressor off and leave it laying in the car. Then I'll start pulling motor mounts and pulling CV axles. I'll hopefully have this engine out of here. I've only been working on this car for probably about 45 minutes, and I'm already this far. So I'm hoping to have this engine completely out of the car in under 3 hours. I'll let you know if I make it in that amount of time, but right now it looks like I'm going to. Even though I showed this in my previous video for doing the water pump and the thermostat, I'm gonna go ahead and explain it again. There's a 14mm bolt down here on the bottom of the alternator, 12mm here, 12mm here. Loosen the 14mm bolt, you don't need to take it all the way out. Loosen this 12mm, you don't have to take it all the way out. Loosen this bolt until you're able to flip that bolt out of this bracket, and then the whole alternator will slide forward. Okay, like I said, once you get that bolt loose, you can flip it up. Then you can unscrew this by hand. And just take this out. All right. Now, in order to get the alternator out, you have to take this bracket off. It's two 12mm bolts. Take those two 12mm bolts out. The top one's longer than the bottom one. But take those two 12mm bolts out, this bracket will come off. Now you need to disconnect the power cable going in right here. And that's a 13mm, I believe. Okay, so the bolt holding the battery cable on is a 12mm, not a 13. I always close this connector back up so I don't lose the cap on it. Once you get that disconnected and you get the bracket removed, you just pull the belt off. I don't know why the son of a bitch don't want to come off, but all right, so there, now the belt's off. Just wiggle it out. Once the belt's off, pull the alternator forward, pick up, twist, and it comes right out. All right, now that the alternator's out, I'm gonna go ahead and disconnect the lower radiator hose, and I'm gonna go ahead and disconnect this bracket that's holding the battery cable that went to the alternator. I'm gonna get under the car to disconnect it and pull it out of the way, get that off, and then I'll take the bolts out for the AC compressor. So there's a 12 millimeter here, 12 millimeter there, and I think there's 2 on the bottom. There may only be 1 on the bottom, but I know there's these 2 top ones, and then there's at least 1 on the bottom. Take that off, and then the AC compressor can just sit up here in the front. And then I should be down to, I'll have to disconnect this ground wire. So I'm gonna disconnect it from here instead of disconnecting it from the engine. I'll worry about that later, but it's a 10 millimeter disconnected here. That'll get it to where it's free. And then I'm gonna go ahead and disconnect my heater core hoses. I'm gonna disconnect them from the heater core instead of from the engine. Okay, correction. Since the heater hoses have never been disconnected before, and this car has 250,000 miles, they're pretty seized onto here, and I don't want to crush the heater core inlet pipes, so I disconnected it from the block. So there's a connection right here, and then the other one's right behind it right here. Now that both of those heater hoses are disconnected, I'm going to go ahead and disconnect the shifter. To disconnect the shifter, you just push over on that part while you pull back on the clip, and then the clip comes out. Pull that washer off, and then the shifter cable comes off. All right, and you have the same kind of clip on the side right here, and typically I'll use pliers to pull that one off, but you pull that one off, and then that shifter cable will slide off as well. All right, once you get the shifter cable safety pins off and get them removed from the transmission shifter linkage, then you just stick underneath here. Don't grab the little metal bracket that they're on, but this pry bar is too long. I got to get a shorter pry bar. But you just pry up on it and the cable will come right out. So there's one cable out, and then there's the other cable out. So there's both of the cables disconnected for the shifter. Just get those up out of your way. All right, so now the only other stuff that I have left to disconnect is I got to disconnect the exhaust back there. It's 2 3/4 inch nuts, or 19 millimeter. And I just disconnect the flex pipe from the bottom of the catalytic converter. So disconnect the flex pipe, and then you'll be, I'm actually going to disconnect it. I don't know if I'll be able to show it, but it's going to be right there. Let me move these cables out of the way. You can see it right there. That's the bolt I'm going to take out. So this O2 sensor is going to stay with the car. So I need to pop it out of these clips that it's in on the exhaust. So it's clipped into these little clips right here, and then it's clipped into this bracket right here. It's this top gray one. And if you just squeeze the pins, you can see them right there. If you just squeeze those together, this will pop off, and you can leave it with the car. Okay, I'm at about 1 hour and 45 minutes into this, tearing this down. I've done everything that I need to do on the top. I may wind up having to remove the exhaust manifold to get enough room to get it to come out of the top of the engine bay. I'll cross that bridge when I get to it. If I need to do that, you have to remove the heat shroud that's over top of the exhaust manifold. And then there's, I think, 8 bolts holding it in. Let me look. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So there's 9 bolts holding the exhaust manifold to the head. And it's got to come off anyway to do the head gasket. So I may just go ahead and pull it after I take the 2 bolts out of the flex pipe, and then just remove the manifold and get it out of my way. But everything else that I need to do to this engine, except for removing the upper engine mounts, has to be done from underneath the car. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and break loose the CV axles, and then pull the CV axles, take the wheels off, pull the CV axles out, and then disconnect the wishbone mount underneath the center of the engine, and then disconnect the rest of the wiring on the front, take the AC compressor off, and then come back up top and start pulling motor mounts and have the hoist hooked up. As you can see, I've already got the hoist set up, ready to go. I still need to break loose the wheel bolts and break loose the CV axle nut, and then pop the CV axles out. When I pop the CV axles out, it is going to drain some gear oil out of the transmission. So have an oil pan underneath there. And then once I get all that disconnected, I'll disconnect the wiring on the front of the motor, that one last battery wire that's running across the front of the engine, disconnect the exhaust, and then I'll be ready to start pulling it. All right, CV axle nuts are off. They're a 32 millimeter. Break them loose, take them off. Sometimes the nut will actually be driven in to where it's crushed against this keyway on the bolt. I take a screwdriver and knock it up. Once you do that, you can spin it out. Now that I've got that off, I'm gonna jack the car up to get it off these ramps and put it on jack stands. Pull the wheel, pull the two bolts that hold the strut to the spindle so that the spindle can slide down, and I'll knock the CV axle out, and then I'll pop it out of the transmission. All right, now that I've got the wheels off, I got it up on jack stands. You can see the jack stand there. Took the brake caliper off. Both of the bolts for the brake caliper and the mounting bracket for the brake caliper are 17 millimeter. So I just took the mounting bracket and the caliper all off all at once. And then the two bolts that hold the strut to the spindle, the bolt is a 17, the nut is a 19. So once you get those loose, take a hammer, knock it through. I run the nut up until it's flush with the end of the bolt. Hit it one real solid time and it will knock it through. And then once that's loose, you can take the CV axle and just push it through. And the reason I took the caliper off is so that I have enough room to swing the CV axle out. Once I get the CV axle out, I'll be able to pop it out of the transmission up there, and then I'll be able to remove the wishbone engine mount that's right there in the center. You can see it right there in the center. And then I'll disconnect the wiring, and I'll remove this splash pan right here. The splash pan's held in with 10 millimeter bolts. There's one here, two in the front, and then the other side of the pan, it's two halves. The other side of the pan has the exact same bolts. So it's a total of 8 bolts holding the entire pan in all the way around the entire front of the engine bay. I almost forgot, in order to get enough swing to get the spindle out of the way, you got to remove the ABS wheel speed sensor. It's a 10 millimeter bolt. Take that bolt out and then wiggle it, and the sensor will come right out. All right, once you get the CV axles loose from the spindle, just take your pry bar, pry in between here and the transmission, and it'll pop right out. I've got both CV axles out. There's the passenger side one, there's the driver's side one. So typically what I like to do, I don't like leaving this stuff hang like this. So I'm gonna take these bolts and hook them back up here. And excuse me for being a little slurred, been drinking. I'm really stressed out right now, and I'm trying to get this done. So I've been drinking a little bit, and it's helping me not get so frustrated, but it's slowing me down. So, and just in case anybody's wondering, yeah, I used to drink Bud Light religiously, and I will never touch that shit again. I am one of the people that's boycotting it. Been boycotting it ever since the very first day. So, yeah, that's the only reason I'm drinking Coors Light. But just figured I'd let y'all in on that. To hell with Anheuser-Busch. All right, now that I have the splash pan removed, and it was only 3 bolts on this side. I thought it was 4, but it's only 3. 1 here and then 2 up there in the corners. I'm gonna go ahead and take the slave cylinder off. It's this nut and this nut right here. And then it's also this bracket right here. If I can get it to show it, that bracket right there. And then I also need to disconnect this ground wire right here. It's a 12 millimeter as well. Once I get that disconnected, then I'm gonna disconnect this sensor right here. Disconnect this bracket that's above this, and disconnect the starter wire, which the starter wire is right there, and it's a 12 millimeter. So get all that loose, and then I was correct. There's 2 12 millimeter bolts holding on the AC compressor on the bottom, and 2 12 millimeters on the top. Once I get that done, I'll remove the wishbone, which I think this is a 17. I'm not 100% certain. And then these are a 12 or a 14. They might be a 14. Yes, those are 14. So the 2 bolts for the wishbone are 14. This is more than likely a 17. I don't know for certain. And then I'm going to take these off, and these are 12. So take all 4 of those off. Once I get those off, this off, and the slave cylinder off, I'll pick back up to show how I remove the rest of this wiring. But I'm going to remove all this wiring off of here, get the ground off, and then everything else is just remove the exhaust, and then I'm ready to go back up top to remove the motor mounts on the top. All right, so now I've got all the wiring disconnected. I just disconnected these spring clips off of the brackets. You just squeeze the sides and they'll pop out. This one, squeeze the sides and it'll pop out. This one was a little bit of a bitch to get off the bracket, so it's mounted to this bracket right here. What I wound up doing was sticking my razor blade up from the back side and pushing down on that tab and then sliding it forward, and it came off. So all the wiring's completely disconnected from the engine, even though it's all laying down in here. It's completely disconnected. So the only thing I have, and the slave cylinder is disconnected. It's down here, right here. So there's a slave cylinder. And the ground wire is disconnected. So only thing I have left underneath to do is disconnect the wishbone mount and disconnect the exhaust at the flex pipe. Okay, everything on the bottom of the engine is disconnected. I got all the bolts out of the AC compressor. I just haven't popped it off the engine yet. But essentially everything's ready to go. Now I just need to hook up the engine lift, disconnect that transmission mount, and disconnect this engine mount. And then I'm ready to pull the motor out. Now to take the transmission mount out, there's a little access hole. This is the panel that's covering it. You remove it from inside the fender well, and then you have access to the 2 14mm bolts. Okay, so I removed the entire flex joint. 3/4 nuts on this end, 3/4 nuts on this end. Take them loose and the whole thing will come right out. You do have to disconnect this gray connector that I mentioned earlier. All you do is just squeeze those 2 clips and it'll pop out, and then pull it out of the clips that are on the exhaust manifold heat shield. So it's getting really dark out here. I'm having to film with a light, but I can't stop because I got to get this freaking car done. So next thing I'm gonna do is pick up my tarp so that I don't ruin it when I put the engine lift over here. But I'm gonna slide the engine lift in place, get it bolted up, get a little bit of pressure taken off of these motor mounts, and then I'm gonna remove both motor mounts. All right, guys, so it took me longer than expected. It took me about 5.5 hours to get this thing out instead of 3. But that's probably because I was drinking and I had to stop and make dinner. It's pretty late right now, so I'm not gonna work on it anymore this evening. But as you can see, the entire engine's out. I did have to take the exhaust manifold off in order to get it to clear the engine bay. But once I took that off, used my leveling system to pitch the transmission side down and the crankshaft side up, and then just kind of wiggled it as it came up, and the thing came right out. So tomorrow morning, I'm gonna get this thing, get the transmission unbolted from it, and put it on an engine stand. That way I can do all the remove the intake manifold, remove the timing system, remove the valve cover, all that good shit. So this is probably where I'm going to end this video. This is just going to be for removing the engine from the engine bay, and then I'll do a new video for doing the head gasket. So it'll be basically, I'll list it as a part 2. All right, so I really hope this video helps people out if they're trying to remove their engine from the naturally aspirated Veloster. It should be pretty similar for the turbo model. I think the only difference would be the exhaust side of the engine. The rest of the engine should be the same. Transmission should be the same. Now, as far as automatic transmission, I don't have one, so I don't know what all's entailed in removing it, but it should be very similar. Like I said, the next video, this will be part 1. Next video will be the head gasket replacement. Tear down of the engine, replacing the gasket, replacing the valve cover gasket, resealing the timing system. I'll do a timing chain inspection while I've got it apart, and we'll go from there. But really hope y'all enjoyed this video, and just wait for part 2 to come out, and hopefully I'll have it posted in a day or two.